welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. I've just returned from Italy and a nearly 2-week tour there, taking a group across the battlefields of Anzio, Monte Cassino, Salerno and along the Adriatic coast. It is, of course, a World War II tour, but as so often with those two great conflicts, they sit side by side, and there were so many occasions for us, for me, in which World War I met World War II in terms of commanders on the ground. Bernard Freiberg, who commanded at Cassino, had been awarded the Victoria Cross on the Somme, and there were many other Great War veterans who were in those battles. But coming back up through northern Italy and on into Austria, I crossed over some of the areas where there was fighting in the Great War in that northern part of Italy and saw memorials to Italians killed in the conflict. And then when we were staying overnight in Austria, some incredibly beautiful and moving memorials to men from Austria who'd served with the Austro-Hungarian forces in those battles of the First World War. And then finally, coming back through Belgium on the return to UK, I crossed over the old front line at Newport on that very northern part of the old Western Front. And I guess things had gone full circle, and it was back to Blighty and back to the podcast. So in this episode of Questions and Answers, the 30th one that we've done, it's a special one in some ways because all of the questions are from some of our American listeners. The number of American listeners has grown substantially over the last year or so. I'm not entirely sure why. It's most welcome. I get a lot of emails from our American listeners who ask very interesting questions, tell me about their connection to relatives in the American Expeditionary Force, and it's always great to hear from them, and indeed all of you who get in contact with the podcast. And some of the people who've asked questions in this episode have been long-time supporters of the podcast and promoters of the podcast as well, again, for which I'm very grateful. But let's get down to the questions and answers, and let's start with question number 1. Our first question comes from JD Hutt. JD has a superb YouTube channel, which I'll thoroughly recommend, and I'll put a link to in the show notes. And he's been very good at promoting what we do with the podcast, and he's very kindly had me on his channel too to talk about the First World War. Anyway, JD asks, I've read that in the early days of gas warfare, before soldiers had gas masks, that the first line of defence was to urinate on a cloth and hold it up to their face. I have to admit that if I were in the trenches and got a strong whiff of some spicy air, my first impulse wouldn't be to pee on a rag and shove it up to my face. Do you know the origins of this practice? I'm curious if there was some foreknowledge about poison gas that led to soldiers being briefed on what to do, or if this was a practice that they figured out along the way. Well, good question, JD. And like you say, it is not something that you're going to do lightly, urinate on a rag and push it into your face. But poison gas existed before the First World War. It was a weapon that had been developed in the Edwardian period, as it would be called in Britain, if not before. And the potential effects on human beings of the use of poison gas were considered so horrific. It was, in terms of that period, what we would now call today a weapon of mass destruction. It was considered too evil, too terrible to use. So there were pre-war conventions that forbid the use of poison gas. Having said that, many nations did develop poison gas, and some of them had them in their military stockpiles when they went to war in 1914. But it was a forbidden weapon. By 1915, the German view was this was now Totalkrieg, total war, and that any methodology, any weapon, any device that could help them win that conflict, that total war, was justified and poison gas would be used. We've looked at this in a separate episode about poison gas in the First World War, which again I'll put in the show notes and on the podcast website. But with poison gas being a known entity, the chemistry behind it was known as well. So when the first gas that was used was employed by the Germans on the Western Front on the Second Battle of Ypres, 22nd of April 1915, at that poison cloud in the evening of the 22nd drifted into the trenches of French territorial soldiers, French colonial soldiers, Canadians and British soldiers who were holding that ground northeast of the city of Ypres. This was a chlorine-based gas, and so the chemistry behind it was understood. And when it came to counteracting it, the French and the British and Canadians, none of them had gas masks. You don't develop the measures to counteract a weapon that's been banned, I guess, and it wasn't there. So under the conditions of that first use of gas, I guess for many men, trying to push their face into the sleeve of their uniform or their tunic in some desperate hope to try and save themselves from the gas just didn't work. Medical officers, seeing the effects of the gas, knowing that it was a chlorine-based gas, they knew that the chemicals in urine could potentially counteract it in a small way. Not totally, not effectively, but in a small way. And that's what led to those Mark I gas masks. And the chemistry behind it was that the urea and ammonia present in urine can react with chlorine gas to neutralise or reduce its harmful effects. So before proper masks soaked in similar chemicals could be issued on a widespread basis, advice was given by medical officers, probably at divisional level initially, and then passed down to the field ambulances and passed on to the regimental battalion medical officers, that if soldiers urinated onto a Mark I gas mask, and it's not just a handkerchief, they could use anything that they had to hand, the cotton materials in field dressings, they could roll up a couple of socks and make an improvised mask from them, and indeed use a handkerchief, probably several, to create a layered effect, and then they would have to urinate onto them. Now, in the midst of battle, that is not an easy proposition, and I often say to groups when we're on the ground looking at gas warfare in the First World War, probably seeing one of these chlorine gas clouds coming towards you was plenty of impetus to urinate onto your handkerchief, your field dressing, your socks, whatever it was, but that urine is only going to last a certain amount of time. It's not going to last probably more than an hour or so, certainly not all day, and you've got to keep urinating onto it. And without drinking more fluids, and given the conditions of the battlefield, that isn't going to be a practical proposition. So essentially, this Mark I gas mask using soldiers' urine wasn't particularly effective. I think it was one of those kind of measures that was put into place to give confidence to troops to stay on the battlefield, but until proper masks, which were not much better than that, which was a series of kind of cotton wadding kind of material with loops to attach to the ears, goggles for the eyes, because chlorine gas can affect the eyes as well, then they would be soaked in similar chemicals to give this counteractive measures to neutralise the effect of the chlorine gas until they were issued. Then this was just a stopgap. This was just an interim measure. And how widely it was practiced, how many soldiers did effectively urinate onto something that they could use to stem the effects of the chlorine gas, honestly, I don't have an exact answer to that. I don't believe anybody would. I suspect, sadly, many men died of the effects of chlorine gas trying to do this and not doing it effectively. And I think what it shows more than anything is the horror of gas warfare in the First World War. Gas is a weapon that we will forever associate with the war in the trenches, particularly on the Western Front, although it was used on many fronts during the conflict. And it was something that certainly haunted the veterans that I interviewed who were gassed. So this temporary measure really marked the way for a whole development of anti-gas measures, including proper gas masks from the hood type that were used by British soldiers in 1915-16 through to the small box respirator that British and Commonwealth soldiers wore in the latter part of the First World War. But that time, that terrible time when gas was first used, resulting in soldiers having to urinate on anything they could get to hand that could soak in that urine and it be placed up against their face, is a terrible reminder of a terrible weapon that inflicted pain and loss and casualties across that battlefield. So a great question, JD, and I hope that's kind of answered it. And it is really kind of one of those strange but true things about the First World War. Question number 2 comes from Beth Gould. Beth asks, I've read that the field of modern reconstructive surgery was born by necessity during World War I. Do you know of other medical innovations that were developed to address the needs of wounded soldiers as well as to treat the unique medical problems that must have arisen from living in the trenches for extended periods? Well, again, this is a really fascinating kind of subject, connected in some ways to the previous one and how the war prompted medical developments, and it did. Any conflict does. And the First World War certainly pushed medicine forward by the end of the conflict. And as you suggest, Beth, reconstructive surgery is one of the best known. There have been some recent books on this subject. And when we look at the horrific injuries that bullets and shrapnel and shell blasts could cause and how soldiers' faces and bodies could be rebuilt, then again, I think this is a bit of an insight into the horror of the Great War. And soldiers wounded on a battlefield went from really just having to kind of live with those injuries from the very beginning of the war through to that reconstructive surgery being quite commonplace by 1918. And 2 of the veterans that I interviewed in particular, Herbert Wheeler and Frank Plum, both had been injured, facially injured on the battlefield and were taken to hospitals where there were these early plastic surgeons who rebuilt their faces. One successfully, Frank's face was kind of wired together and rebuilt. The lower part of his jaw had almost been blown off. And when I knew him, he had lots of kind of silvery scars where you could see there'd been damage, but he had no earlier pictures of himself, so I don't know what he looked like in the 1920s. But he lived a pretty normal life and a happy life in many ways. Herbert Wheeler was a different prospect because he'd been given one of those China face masks and he had to live with the stigma of that. I think that possibly made him stand out just as much as the wounds themselves. And when he died, I contacted his daughter to try and get her to give the China mask to the Imperial War Museum because I don't think that they had an original of one of those, but she'd smashed it with a hammer because she'd grown up as the child of a soldier with these facial injuries, with this terrible mask, and to her it was a symbol of something very, very different, and she wanted it destroyed as quickly as possible. But the ability, despite the kind of outcomes like that, the ability to try and rebuild a soldier's physical appearance like that was cutting edge at that time. It had never been seen before, and it led to the whole progression of that kind of surgery in the next conflict with airmen, for example, who were shot down in aircraft that caught fire, and they had terrible injuries from that were treated based on the experience of doing that kind of surgery in the First World War. But this is only part of the story, and it is a big story which we should probably look at in a podcast, Medical Advancement in the Great War. But when we look at the battlefield, the very process of treatment of soldiers when they were wounded was all part of that development. The casualty evacuation system, from regimental aid posts to dressing station to casualty clearing station to base hospital, hospital ship, and then return to the UK, that development of the categorisation of treatment and then looking at soldiers who come in wounded and then deciding which ones can be treated quickly, swiftly, put on ambulances and taken back, and which ones are more problematic, and unfortunately which ones are not going to survive the wounds, was all part of the development of how soldiers were treated when they were brought off the battlefield. So that's a key element in it as well. And There are many other things. Blood transfusions, for example, blood groups and blood storage. All of that was a great development in medicine during the period of the First World War. Blood transfusion kits have been found on archaeological digs near to casualty clearing stations, for example. They didn't entirely understand blood groups, so some men were given blood transfusions with the wrong type of blood, and it didn't really help. But blood storage, to take blood and store it to help treat soldiers when they come in from the battlefield, was again a new thing. And this was developed by Captain Oswald Robertson, who was a British-born American citizen who'd been educated at Harvard, and he was serving on the Western Front with the British Army. And he essentially developed the first blood banks using sodium citrate to prevent clotting. Now, I'm not an expert on the medical properties of all that, but as a layperson, I guess, in terms of medicine, I can see how important it would be for medical officers at casualty clearing stations and base hospitals to have blood banks they can call on when lots of casualties come in. So that was a major, major leap forward in the treatment of soldiers. And in addition to blood transfusions, there were x-rays, so portable x-ray machines could be taken as far forward as a casualty clearing station that could be 6 to 8 miles from the battlefield. So when a soldier comes in with a fractured limb caused by bullets or shrapnel or impacts in the trenches, being thrown around in bombardments, breaking arms and legs, the x-rays could be used to decide how that would be treated and where the breakages actually were, and also be used to see where shrapnel was in the body as well. And some examples of these x-rays survive in the very small percentage of medical files that were kept and then eventually transferred to the National Archives. The full set of medical records relating to individuals and all types of wounds were kept up until the 1980s, and they were offered to the National Archives, Public Records Office as it was then, but they decided they could only take a small sample, and they only took 5%, so 95% of those records were destroyed as late as the early 1980s. The Western Front Association in those days petitioned to try and have them saved, but it was a small organisation then. There was almost no public interest in the First World War, and those precious, precious records were lost. There was also, in addition to the physical treatment of soldiers in terms of wounds, there was the advances in medical health treatment as well. We often hear how the army didn't recognise shell shock and it shot men for it. I mean, there's all kinds of elements of truth and misinformation in that, but the recognising of the existence of shell shock was something that happened as early as 1915. Soldiers would come into casualty clearing stations, for example, and be treated and be recognised as having shell shock, and there were a number of other names for it as well, and they could go on to have treatment for it in the UK. The best known examples of this are the war poets Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, who, being lucky, ended up in a shell shock hospital for officers at Craig Lockhart, where they met Rivers, who was a medical officer who believed in the talking therapy, and he sat them down and talked them and many others through their experiences. If you were unlucky, you might end up in a shell shock hospital where the medical officers there believed that this was some kind of physical manifestation of a wound, that it wasn't a mental health issue, because they saw men quivering and shaking and climbing under tables. And mutism was a common manifestation of shell shock, soldiers being unable to speak. And all kinds of brutal treatments were carried out to try and cure, in inverted commas, those kind of conditions. And while views on shell shock, on neurasthenia, and the whole mental health of soldiers changed by the end of the conflict, there were still plenty of arguments. When Britain went to war again in 1939, there were still plenty of medical officers who believed that shell shock was a disease of malingerers, that it was made up to get out of the battlefield, get away from the battlefield, and get out of your duty. And I think that the struggle really to help identify, treat, assist people who have served in the armed forces who have mental health issues, it's a battle, I think, that continues, sadly, to this day in all kinds of ways. So what we've got here then, Beth, as you can see, is just a few examples of how medicine moved forward rapidly in the First World War. And it really transformed not just military medicine, but medicine across the world, and the treatment of ordinary civilians changed, got better as a consequence of these sacrifices and experiences in the First World War. And it's, I guess, if there is a positive outcome of conflict, it is one of them. And it's certainly a subject that we will return to another day. So thanks for that one, Beth. Question number 3 comes from Bill Peterson. Bill asks, a question I have had for some time regarding the Battle of the Somme is this. The mine which was exploded at 7:20 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916 at Hawthorne Ridge and famously recorded by Geoffrey Malins, how far down the chain of command were soldiers aware it was going to happen? Only at the officer level or to the private soldier level as well? And what about other mines? Well, this is a good question, Bill, and mine warfare was another development in warfare on the Western Front when the war went underground, when it became static. It was born out of that static nature of the Western Front, and mines were used to harass the enemy, to blow up key positions, and then increasingly in big offensives or small-scale localized attacks. And there had been instances in which the engineers and the infantry had not synchronized watches correctly, the right kind of information had not been passed back and forth between them, so that men had held back in the trenches waiting for a mine to go off, and the whole momentum of battle had been slowed down, and other occasions in which men had gone over the bags into no man's land and the mine had gone off and took out some of them as they advanced on the enemy positions. So the briefing of soldiers was widespread. Those who were going to be in the first wave of the assault directly facing a mine explosion were briefed. And in some cases, the units around them, supporting them, were also briefed because people had to know that this massive explosion was going to take place. And I think within the 29th Division, which was the British division that made the attack on Beaumont Hamel on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, where the Hawthorne mine went off, this was a common practice. In the eve of the battle, when soldiers were assembled, they were told that this was going to take place. Now, there's a risk with that, of course, because if they go into the trenches the night before and the Germans raid, they can drag a prisoner back and he might blab the fact that a mine is going to go off. There's no evidence that that happened for the 1st of July, but it can be a risk when you give this kind of information out. But gradually, as the war went on, the army told ordinary soldiers more and more. So in terms of this specific example, the assault battalions who were in the area that's now the Newfoundland Park, so 2nd Battalion South Wales Borderers, 1st Border Regiment behind them, the Newfoundlanders and the 1st Essex, and then on the battlefield facing Hawthorne Ridge, the 2nd Royal Fusiliers, supported by men from the Monmouthshire Regiment and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and then down in the Sunken Lane, the 2nd Lancashire Fusiliers, and behind them the 16th Middlesex, and probably some of the units on the 4th Division who were on their flanks were briefed that this mine explosion was going to take place so that they weren't suddenly surprised by it. I mean, you're hardly going to miss it when it goes off. And importantly, the advance party of the 2nd Battalion Royal Fusiliers that went forward at 7:20 a.m, just as the mine exploded, obviously they had to be aware of it. Every man in those rifle sections that went forward, with men from the trench mortar battery and the machine gun company, to get to the lip of the crater, dig in, hold it, just in case the enemy popped up. And of course, they did pop up, and a firefight ensued. So there was already, by the time of the Somme, the beginning of this passing down of information just to ordinary soldiers, as well as officers and higher ranked staff officers and commanders. It was realised gradually as the war went on that the more information a soldier was given, the better he would perform on the battlefield. I mean, kind of no surprise there, but it took the army a long time to accept that, with a citizen army of volunteers at the beginning of the war and then a conscript army as well. And if we look at later mine offensives, Messines being the ultimate example of it, then everybody was briefed on that. They took men out of the line and they had whole instructional areas behind the front where massive models of the Messines battlefield had been constructed so that everybody could be briefed on their battalion plan, their brigade plan, their divisional plan, and everyone knew what was happening. And you begin to see really a sea change in this, with even ordinary soldiers being given trench maps, for example, even if they were just small versions of maps that could be used on the battlefield over which you were about to fight. So it kind of mirrored really the changing nature in the way the army, the British Army on the Western Front, fought its battles and told soldiers what was happening. Soldiers always feel in the dark, which is why you kind of get these estaminet stories that I often refer to, when men come out of the line and they begin talking to each other and rumours grow, and you get to a point where you have to have a rumour control officer. So it's better to inform men, and the army got better at that. They never told them everything. I think it was Wellington who said that it's better that a soldier doesn't know what lies before him. I mean, there's truth in that, but I think in total war, industrial war, 20th century warfare, then information is key really to soldiers doing their bit on the ground, because if it's only invested in a small number of men and they get killed or wounded, then the whole fabric of that battle begins to peel apart because no one knows what they're doing, and an army becomes a rabble. And in the case of the Hawthorne mine bill that you mentioned, one of those, of course, who definitely knew it was going off was Geoffrey Malins, who you mentioned, who was the cinematographer, with Lieutenant Brooks, Baby Brooks, alongside him, both perched in that position along the embankment just down from the sunken lane, looking up towards the Hawthorne Ridge and ready to capture that moment for posterity. And they became Brooks's images. Malins' film became really some of the standard images of the Great War as a consequence of that. So thanks for that question, Bill, which kind of hints at all kinds of other aspects of the First World War as well. So on to our fourth and final question, which comes from Frank Myers. Frank says, "My question is, when did the troops wear their backpacks and when didn't they? It seems obvious to me that they wouldn't wear them when they were in the trenches or going on a raid. But for major offensives, it seems like they would wear them in anticipation of spending the next night in the enemy's trenches. I thought that, but when I read a Saxon's letter home where he says he was left behind to guard the unit's backpacks during a major German push, that suggested, at least for the Germans, they didn't always wear their backpacks for major pushes, or maybe just some troops didn't, such as the runners, bombers, and the machine gunners. Any insight would be appreciated." Well, Frank, in the British Army, the standard set of equipment they wore was the 1908 pattern webbing equipment. And then when not enough of that could be produced, in 1914, they brought in the 1914 pattern leather equipment, which was a kind of leather copy of it with box pouches instead of webbing pouches with little tiny pockets to put your ammunition in. So a slightly different thing. But in both sets of equipment, there were two packs, what was called the large pack and the small pack. And the small pack, the haversack, was the one that was mainly worn on the battlefield. It's a much smaller pack. It can be worn in different ways. So using the equipment, you can have it down by your side, or you can have it attached to the straps on your back so that it's fixed to that area of your kind of upper back, just below the neckline. And there was a large pack as well, and they were for two different purposes. So the small pack, the haversack, was for your standard kit that you needed while you were going about your soldierly duties. The large pack was to put your greatcoat and some other items in, and was not normally to be taken onto the battlefield. So in a British and Commonwealth unit, when they were marching from a village behind the lines, they would be in their full equipment, haversack, large pack on their back, marching up to the forward trenches. They would get to what were called the transport lines of the battalion, which would be a position behind the front, where the transport section of the battalion would be there with rations, ammunition, equipment, and the large packs would be taken off and left there because they were too big and cumbersome for the trenches, just as you kind of indicate in your question. And the packs were left there. Somebody was put on guard, just like the Saxon soldier that you mentioned, and I suspect the Germans had a similar approach to this with their large pack that they wore as part of their equipment. So large packs left behind at the transport lines, and then the men go into the trenches in battle order, as it's often referred to. So ammunition pouches, bayonet, entrenching tool handle attached to the bayonet, entrenching tool head, the helve, the top metal part of the entrenching tool in a little pouch at the back of the equipment, water bottle, and then small pack haversack. And in there are the soldiers' accoutrements that they need, unused portion of rations, all that kind of stuff. And then you go up onto the battlefield, into the trenches, and you've normally got all that kit about you. And if you're going to go over the top into battle, you'd have it as well, because the haversack would be used to carry whatever you needed in terms of grub. Your emergency iron rations, for example, would be in there. That would all be in the small pack, and that would be worn when you went over the top. Again, the large pack left behind, you remember. So they go into battle with all that, and often carry additional gear as well, bandoliers of extra ammunition, equipment for other units within their battalion, extra machine gun ammunition, tools like shovels and picks, barbed wire picket, rolls of barbed wire, all that kind of gear. But you've still got your basic equipment underneath. You go into battle and you've got everything you need on the battlefield. Now, back at the transport lines are all of the large packs, and each of those have got the soldier's name in there. Often they left behind personal stuff in there that they didn't want to lose on the battlefield or lose if they got killed or wounded. So that would be in there. And after a big attack, when units went in, soldiers would be killed and wounded in that attack, and men would come back from the assault. Those that were still alive, unwounded, would pick up their large packs and take them off to wherever they were going, probably another village behind the front line for a bit of rest after battle. And that would leave a whole number of packs left behind at the transport lines, and it would be a quick and ready way of doing a quick casualty calculation, because the ones who hadn't come back to pick those packs up would be dead or they would be wounded. And then it was the job of someone to go through these packs, pick out personal gear, have that sent back to the family, and any military equipment within it, the pack itself, the greatcoat, anything else, would then be recycled effectively. So that was the purpose, certainly in the British and Commonwealth forces, of those two packs. So when we see films, and there are plenty of them, where we see men going over the top with the large pack, that is not something that was done as standard practice in trench warfare. At the beginning of the war, when the regular army went to war, soldiers carried everything they needed, including that large pack. So the large pack would be on their back, the haversack would be at their side, and in those long retreats from Mons to Le Cateau to the Marne and the Aisne, soldiers were carrying all that kind of gear and often fighting in it as well. So that was a different period of the war. When trench warfare came in, it was much more common for the large pack not to be taken into the forward zone of the battlefield and used in that manner which we just spoke about, as a quick and ready casualty calculation when a unit came out of action. And in terms of the specialist troops that you mentioned, they had their own kind of rig as well. So if you look at photographs, and there are some really great books on uniforms and equipment of the First World War, so many out there, it's impossible to really just recommend one of them. But if you look at the imagery of the First World War, and having collected those kind of images for over 40 odd years now, it's something that I'm eternally fascinated with, to see how soldiers wore the gear that they were issued. So specialist troops like Lewis machine gunners, for example, because they were carrying the machine gun and the ammunition, they carried a kind of stripped down version of the webbing gear, which did have a haversack, but they didn't carry the full ammunition pouches with 150 rounds of small arms ammunition, because they were carrying a machine gun and the ammunition to go with it. Regimental, battalion level stretcher bearers, they were infantry soldiers, they were trained on weapons, they could fire weapons, they could carry weapons, but as stretcher bearers, the stretcher and the medical equipment that they carried was too cumbersome, so they had, again, a stripped down version of the webbing gear so that they could prioritise things like field dressings and other medical equipment that they would need. And often they would paint a red cross onto their haversack to indicate that they were stretcher bearers, as well as having the stretcher bearer's armband round their tunic sleeve as well. And then all kinds of other soldiers like signallers and men who were in machine gun companies and trench mortar units, again, all had a variety of equipment based on what their task was and how heavy the big gear was that they were carrying into battle. But a haversack, a small pack, remained essential to almost every soldier, because he carried his basic accoutrements in there, spare pair of socks, his housewife to repair his uniform and equipment, his roll of personal gear, shaving equipment, a knife, fork and spoon, a shoe brush, all that kind of stuff was in there, plus personal items, diaries, letters, postcards from home, stuff you were going to send home. I mean, it wasn't very big, but they stuffed an awful lot of gear in there, and as infantry soldiers, that was the only place that they could carry anything of any kind of size. So it was an important bit of kit, but the very big pack, that was the one that wasn't always taken on to the battlefield. And there are some photographs of transport lines with these packs all piled up, and it must have been quite evocative, actually, I think, coming back from a battle, picking up your pack and then kind of looking around the pile of packs that are beside you, knowing that many of those men will never come back to take their pack because they've fallen in the battle that you've just fought. And I think books like Her Privates We and one or two others refer to this huge pile of webbing gear of men who've been killed in the last great push. So again, Frank, a simple piece of equipment can often have a much greater symbolism as the conflict moves on. So thanks for those great questions. Thanks to our American listeners who sent them in. Thanks to all of you who listen wherever it is. And I'm staggered by the number of countries that now listen to the podcast. Keep those questions coming, and you can send them in via email, via the Discord server, and links to those are in the show notes for this episode. So until we meet again, see you next time for some more questions and answers on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.